want to weigh in and we need a quorum. So
That sounds good. Well, we'll get everything kicked off. Welcome everybody to the December 5th meeting of the Bend Economic Development Advisory Board. Let's get started with public input. Is there anybody here to speak in front of the board?
yeah, so we have one person with their hand raised. The name is Bernie Galore. Bernie, I'm going to allow you to speak.
Excellent.
I'm embarrassed. That was a joke. Bernie is my granddaughter's name. And
Oh,
hi, Don.
I did this. I wonder why it wasn't being added. So sorry about that. If you could add me and I'll remove Bernie's name and we'll just go forward.
Happy grandparent there. I like it.
Okay.
All right. With nobody else to
Don,
speak.
we'll promote you, Don. And yeah, sorry about that. My finger was hovering over the mute button, waiting to see what Bernie Galore had to say, but it was done. So.
That's awesome. It's like an Austin Powers character name. All right. Well, next on our agenda to discuss November 7th meeting minutes. Did everybody get a chance to review those? And are there any comments?
And I will note, Kevin had a couple of changes that I made. One was to the motion to adopt the minutes from the last meeting. And then also we talked a lot about SWOT analyses at the last meeting. And in at least one area, it was spelled SWAT, different kind of SWOT. So made those changes. Thanks, Kevin, for always reading the notes.
I appreciate that. I'm also excited to hear the update on the subcommittee meeting that Keith and Brianna attended, but we can talk about that next.
With the changes been noted, I'll move approval of the minutes as amended.
Thank you, Kevin. Does anyone want a second?
I'll second that.
Excellent. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Well, can we even do it? We
And
don't even know.
actually, yeah, Keith, good catch. Yeah, we don't have a quorum, so we'll have to hold off. And if Tierney does show up later in the meeting, we can make that motion then, or if not,
Yeah.
We'll just add it to the next agenda.
Yeah, okay. Appreciate that. All right. Well, before we jump into the SDC methodology, do we want to report out on that committee meeting that Keith, did you attend, and Brianna?
Yeah. Well, Brianna's probably like me. I went to Las Vegas over Thanksgiving, so I've kind of forgotten all about most of the stuff on the meeting. And Brianna just came back from Costa Rica, so she's probably doesn't remember. I don't know. Do you have any notes? Do you have any notes?
I had to read back through them, but yeah, I think
because I'm trying to do it from memory.
Yeah, it was mostly just, I mean, the determining where the funds could go. I think the consensus at the end of the meeting was definitely putting the dollars towards things that could stay in the community and stay at that property or that location. So they were talking about adding some different surveys or checklists that I think that committee has put together for evaluating or determining applicants and how to prioritize them, which I think there will be more to come on that. But as far as the general direction that it's going, it would be things like what you've seen in maybe Lapine or Redmond, where they're doing facade improvements or street infrastructure improvements that are aligning with the goals that with the added layer, I think, of the cultural aspect and diversity and inclusion. So figuring out how to prioritize or emphasize those elements, which I haven't necessarily seen in other as a criteria for scoring in other communities.
Yeah, I think that was probably the majority of the conversation was, was how to prioritize, what the application process was going to look like, and in what kind of projects would be the top of the list for this somewhat limited amount of money. And because I guess there's requests. I don't know if there's requests already or conversations about some of the businesses in the area who want to expand. I think somebody wanted, $30,000 worth of equipment. for their market restaurant or something. And it's, you know, if they don't own the building, so if they move their location, whether they're forced to by a landlord or not, you know, the 30,000 now moves out of the area when it's supposed to be, you know, used in the BCD. So that was kind of a concern. I think most people figured, you know, then it was kind of like, well, you know, if a tenant is there and the tenant wants tenant improvements, but they're really going towards the building, then isn't really the landlord benefiting, you know, rather than the tenant? It's kind of like, well, does it matter? It's, you know, if there are improvements that are staying in the BCD and that's where the money is supposed to be spent, it seems like it makes sense to me. It doesn't matter who applies for it, who gets the ultimate benefit. It's going to go to the building most likely. There are some tenant improvements, of course, that can be done and then abandoned by a business, right? And then they might get torn out because the next user has a whole different idea of what they need. But I think mostly it's kind of the equipment and really movable, more personal property that most people were in agreement. We didn't want to be in that, you know, especially with such a limited amount of money. I mean, we know how that money is going to be doled out over time. It really doesn't come out to very much. And then one conversation I think a little bit was where should any streets or areas be prioritized? And I personally felt that they should prioritize like Second Street, you know, say First and Second Street, and then the cross streets in between in the BCD. Most people thought that they should prioritize probably the Greenwood to Franklin area, even though the area north of Greenwood is also part of it. But it seemed to make sense with the limited amount of money that maybe the other areas should go first. But, you know, doing Franklin, Greenwood, and Third Street improvements with this limited amount of money, you know, would you even notice if a business spent $1 million on Third Street, would you really even notice? I mean, you know, so I think for the bang for your buck type thing, and in terms of improving the overall look of the BCD, that, you know, my personal opinion was that it should be on like First and Second and down in that area, you know, noticeable stuff.
Well, it's going to have to be responsive to the submissions we get, I guess. So we'll just see what comes in.
What Travis just said is, I think where it landed was like, well, do we even know that we're going to get only applicants from that area or this area? And then do you not spend the money because you didn't get any applicants in that area? I think I felt like the conversation got really specific when maybe it needs to be more general in order to capture or utilize the funds, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, and I'll add, I'm lucky enough to share an office with Allison Platt. So I've seen how she's taking this work from this working group. And I think it is more figuring out what 3 buckets of programs look like, and then bringing that back to both her board and I think BDAB as well. So it was all good feedback, but I think probably it is going in more in that direction of what are some general kind of paths to put businesses or people on that want to come in for assistance, and at least be able to exclude folks that really don't make sense for accessing urban renewal in the future. So stay tuned, but Brianna, I'm glad you're both there.
Yeah, thank you both for attending. Thanks for the update too. All right, let's move on to SDC methodology. Sound good, Ben?
It does.
So this is the kickoff for a long process of reviewing the SDC pricing methodology.
And Sarah already turned her camera on, but I can tee this up real quick, Sarah, if that would be useful. So Sarah Hudson, Senior Policy Analyst, is that your title, Sarah?
Senior Manager, yeah. Yes, that's the essence of it. Don't need to be overly precise.
And then Russ Grayson, who's here in the room. We're in front of you probably 3 months back, maybe 4 months back, to talk about SDCs and this kind of work we're going to do on updating the methodology. Sarah's actually getting that work started now. Sarah, you can probably speak to it a little more on what that is going to entail, but we're looking for volunteers. Just want to be very clear before turning it over to Sarah. SDCs and fees are 2 different things, right? So fees are what you pay for someone to review your permit. SDCs are the impact fees you pay for impact on the transportation system or the sewer system or the parks system or the water. I knew I was forgetting one. So yeah. So Sarah, yeah, I'll turn it over to you. The goal here is
Thank you.
presentation, just a quick update.
Yeah, thank you so much for teeing that up. Yeah, I think it was August that Russ and I were last at one of your meetings. So I can give a quick update. So since then, we've hired Ghilardi Rothstein Group as the consultant to help us with this work. Particularly, there's just a very complicated calculation that goes into it. So they help with kind of formulating that methodology, and then they'll also help with facilitating some of the stakeholder engagement. And that's what I wanted to talk to you all about today. I think back in August, we had asked if anyone from the group would be willing to be representative for BDAB through that process. And so now we're getting closer to really kicking that off. I think it's really looking like it will begin at the beginning of February, somewhere in that time frame. And there's probably going to be about 4 stakeholder meetings, probably like spaced 3 weeks apart, 1 to 2 hour time commitment each meeting, that kind of thing. And would really love to have representation from this group as part of that process. So we'll be really discussing a lot of the policy implications of this work, and looking at Ghilardi Rothstein's group technical analyses that they prepare to inform that discussion and our decision making. So want to make sure that we have good representation in that group for those policy discussions. So that's kind of the big picture of it. I can answer any questions, and I'm not sure, it seems like maybe you guys don't have full attendance today. I don't know if you want to decide right now who would want to be part of it, or if that's a discussion to happen offline and circle back. But that would be great to have involvement from this group.
So Sarah, to set expectations here, am I right in saying that overall system development fees to support the growth in each of the buckets, transportation, water, that those fees, we're going to have to collect that money somehow. What we're looking is the redistribution of how the calculation is made. So we're not going to go from a single family house, the average single family house, from 25,000 down to 5,000. That's just never going to happen in our current environment.
Right. So, and there's a couple things. I'm not sure if Russ is in the audience. I can't quite see, and you're welcome to jump in at any point. But yeah, these fees can only be used for kind of new growth. It's fees we already collect upon development or redevelopment. And we're just looking at making sure we want to look at the overall implementation structure of those fees to bring alignment between how we actually implement the water, the sewer, the transportation, because right now they're all calculated slightly differently. So kind of bring alignment and make it easier for the development community. And also just making sure, are we charging the right amount? Because it needs to support projects in our master plans that contribute to growth in the system. And Russ can probably more eloquently answer some of this as well, if you want to add anything, Russ.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Good afternoon, everybody. Russ Grayson, Chief Operations Officer. So really, this study will do 2 things. One, it'll look at kind of what should the overall charge be. So to break it, to simplify it, it's going to say we need X amount of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure that is basically contributable to growth related activities going on within the city. And then that's the first part of the equation, like what projects are we building, what projects are growth eligible, and then how much money are we trying to basically, how much revenue are we trying to get through this charge to help pay for that infrastructure bill. That's kind of the first one. The second part of that is, and how do you equate that to all the different types of developments that we have going on in town, whether that's a single family house. We now have all these different housing types, which is going to be part of the discussion. Like, do you charge the same amount for a 3,500 square foot house versus 1,000 square foot house versus an apartment versus a micro unit versus a duplex versus, you can slice and dice a lot of different ways. And then obviously then we translate that over to the commercial world and say, do we want to do just on new construction and expansions? Do we want to do when a tenant changes within the building? Right now, our process is very cumbersome. If anyone's ever been through it, we have way too many categories, and it's really, I mean, you basically have to pay the city a fee to figure out what your charge is going to be. It's that complicated. So trying to find a way to simplify it. Also, we want to do this in one big swoop instead of, doing the transportation SDC methodology, and then talk about the water, and then the parks does it, and then we do the sewer. I'd rather have one large conversation because most developers go right to what Travis just said. It's 25 grand per house. And I'd rather have one holistic conversation around all the impacts of these numbers in one big conversation. So hopefully that helps frame it a little bit. And Sarah, I think we're thinking 4 to 5 meetings over, probably a 3-month period.
Yep,
all these
exactly.
things. And again, large stakeholder group with really representation from the developers, both on the commercial and the residential side, as well as other critical stakeholders in the community that we want to bring in, BDAB being one, obviously the AHAC, the Affordable Housing Group being another, and those type of things.
Can you tell us about Parks's involvement? So they're going to be a stakeholder. We're going to discuss it, but is it up in the air whether the city's going to remain the collector of their fees?
Right now, we're basically having an agreement with the parks to continue doing that. I will tell you from an administrative standpoint, it makes a lot more sense for the city to do that because we're dealing with, the way the system's set up now. But again, we're going to have questions around, if that's one of the policy discussions we want to have, we can do that. As well as the affordable housing deferrals and things like that, what type of, because right now we have stuff in our code and other things, but if we also want to make sure, do we want to have a larger discussion with parks of saying, can we just make an outright exemption for affordable housing? How do we recover that cost through all the other types of development that occur? Do we childcare, and are there other things that we want to exempt as well to help spur development?
I see Kevin's raised.
Makes sense. Go ahead, Kevin.
So my question is this project a regularly scheduled review of the fees, or is there a desire from council to change how those fees are distributed that we're trying to address here?
This is kind of in the normal operations of updates. So we typically what happens is, you redo your master plan, which now gives you a new project list of what needs to be built within the city. After those kind of infrastructure master plans are done, usually the next step is you update your system development charge methodology to be more in concert with those recently adopted master plans. But in theory, yes, it's how deep of a dive do we want to go on this, and where do we want to focus? Because right now we have a couple staff people in our office and within CEDD that this is all they do is calculate these things and get in arguments with lots of people about how the process works and what we want to do. And also we want to use this obviously as an education tool, because everyone drops into the standard, I don't want to pay the $25,000 per house. They also don't, I want to make sure everyone fully understands, well, what is this money being used for first? Then we can have a conversation about the impacts to other development, but it's really how do we fund infrastructure within the city? And this is one of the tools to do that.
And will these changes be effective July 1st of next year?
We don't know yet, Kevin. That's one of the things we'll be talking about. Our target is to try to get these fee increases, at least some of them in. If we have clear definition on what the baseline charge needs to be, which is kind of the first half of the methodology, we could update those and then come back later with a new implementation schedule of how those are done across all cost categories later in the year. There's also typically depends on what those numbers come back as in terms of the impacts of the increases. Do we have a multi-step implementation program of those fees? Do we do half of it now and half of it 6 months down? Those are all policy questions that we'll have. We don't have any of those data points yet to tell you kind of what we're seeing, but it's going to be part of the conversation moving forward. And that's why we're kind of waiting to start this in early February, because we'll have that first round of kind of, as Sarah was alluding to, the complicated computations that need to occur on the methodology. We'll have the first cut of those before we start talking to the stakeholder group. So we got the background data.
And then how often, so they'll be updated as a package, and then how often do you think it'll be? Do you have any idea? Every 5 years? Or?
Typically we try to do them every 5 years, but I think if we can get, normally you don't do the implementation, like all the different cost categories. Hopefully we can get into this thing if we can get a good structure set in on how we charge against all the different development types that go on within the city. Then we're going through this kind of 5-year cycle. If you update your master plan, then you update the methodology, and then you just change the base fee, and all the calculations work out in the implementation, because it's really just like an input to a spreadsheet formula.
Right.
Across all those.
And Sarah, you're looking for 2 or just one, up to 2?
Up to 2. I think ideally having a representative and then maybe an alternate or someone in case there's scheduling conflict.
Because we will have 2 new BDAB members by January. Those interviews are about to kick off pretty quick here with Councilor Perkins and I think with current Mayor Goodman Campbell, right? And there are some folks on that list that applied that have some pretty deep development expertise. So if one of those two openings ends up filled by one of those folks, could be a good backup option too, if there's only one person on this call that wants to participate.
I think.
Yeah, man, I'm
Project Life-
definitely interested in it. Go ahead, Kevin.
I think the project life exceeds my,
Hope you just muted, Kevin.
I think the project life exceeds my term on VDAB.
It's close. Yeah, both of us being gone at the end of June, but perhaps one newer, one older member, or Brianna, I see you just unmute yourself. If you're going to volunteer for one more group, we'll accept. Your expertise is helpful, but I know you've been busy.
I'll just run, we're hoping the stakeholder portion of the project is completed by like the end of June of next year. It may be of just working with council of, okay, when do we want to implement this, and some other kind of, at least the recommendations coming out of the stakeholder group will be complete, and then we're working directly with council to figure out how and what we want to implement.
Yeah, and if Kevin and Travis, if you're both interested, instead of Brianna getting pulled into another stakeholder committee right now, it could be an option to wait and see who ends up appointed into one of those 2 open spots on BDAB as well in January.
Yeah, that sounds great. The good news, Sarah, is you're going to have takers, so we would love to participate. And this is right in our wheelhouse of, one of our primary goals is helping bridge the communication and ease of doing business between the business community and the city of Bend. And this is something we care deeply about. So if we can make the process easier, I know we're not going to make everybody happy by making their particular development style less expensive. That's not going to happen. But if we can make it more predictable and more streamlined, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's perfect fit. Well, thank you. I'm really glad to hear that there's interest in participating. So
Like a job for Karna too.
She'll be involved.
Yep.
Yeah, no doubt.
Guarantee. That's almost a guarantee.
It's great. All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Russ. Next on our agenda, our favorite climate-friendly and equitable cities. We've got a parking discussion. Pauline is here to discuss that.
Yeah, and I sent an email out maybe 2 weeks ago when Pauline was giving this exact same presentation to the Core Area Advisory Board, CAB. Got some interesting questions from a number of you based on that email. So here's your opportunity to ask those questions after Pauline has presented. I don't think BDAB necessarily has to weigh into council on this. It's always an option for you, although we don't have a quorum, so we'll have to discuss how to handle that when we get there. But at the very least, given all of your roles and interactions with folks in the business community, I think this is important info for you to be aware of.
Definitely.
Pauline, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. And sorry ahead of time, I have a cold, so that's why I'm doing it on Zoom instead of being there in person with everybody. So as Ben mentioned, we are going through a process of updating the Bend Development Code, addressing the new rules that were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in July of this year. And although they were just adopted in July, there's some pretty short timeframes that the cities are obligated to comply with. One going into effect at the end of this year for parking code requirements. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about that and just give you the background of what the options were that the city council reviewed during a work session that they held. So the climate friendly and equitable communities, also called CFEC rules, includes 2 phases, phases A and B. And then this gets a little confusing, so I'll try and make it as clear as possible for you. And then the 2 phases A and B, and then with B, there's also additional options the city has to pick. There's 3 of them, and we'll go through the 3 options and their deadlines too. So the rules have a number of things that the city has to comply with, but for this purpose, we're just focusing on parking. And so parking A is the first thing a city has to comply with by the end of this year. It goes into effect on December 31st. And it requires cities, even if you don't update your Ben development or any development code, they still apply. And the amendments include not requiring more than one space per residential development. So today, like our duplexes, triplexes, they don't require any parking. And our quadplex is only one space per development. But anything more than that now, like multifamily would be one space per unit. And then in addition to reducing that number, there's requirements to eliminate parking altogether for small units, which is defined as smaller than 750 square feet. So for example, if you're familiar with our micro unit developments, they can't be larger than 400 square feet per unit. So that would go down to no parking requirements. And then affordable housing and publicly supported housing. And this is defined a little bit differently than how the Ben Development Code defines it. Those definitions are in the OARs, and if they comply and meet those definitions, then they would be required to put in any parking. In addition, childcare facilities, facilities with people with disabilities, as well as the shelters. We just went through that whole process for the shelter, 3 different shelters for the city of Bend. None of those would require any parking requirements. And just to be clear, even though we're saying that there'd be no minimum parking requirements, a developer still has the option to put in parking. And the Ben Development Code today has a maximum of 150% of the minimums that they can put in. So with the code update package, we've just converted those numbers to still have maximum parking requirements, but no minimums. And developers can put in parking if they choose to do so. Another area that goes into effect by the end of this year is no minimum parking requirements allowed within a half mile of a frequent transit corridor. And for the city of Bend, a frequent transit corridor is routes along Greenwood and Newport, and then most of 3rd Street would be if you're within a half a mile of those transit routes, and you wouldn't have any minimum parking requirements. So that was parking A, phase 1, and then parking B is the beginning of phase 2 requirements that a city has to comply with. And then so parking for phase 2, most of it goes into effect at the end of June of this coming year, except for one area that goes into effect at the end of March. So first, a city with phase 2 parking B has to update their codes to include the policies that you can see on the screen. There's about 7 of them. So basically, any designated employee parking areas must provide preferential parking for carpools and van pools. You have to allow redevelopment of a parking area if it's for bike or transit uses. You have to allow and encourage redevelopment of underused parking and also include facilitated shared parking. And then if you're going to do a rather large parking lot, so they consider large being 1/4 of an acre in size or greater, the developer will have 2 options. One is to install 50% tree canopy, and there's a whole bunch of requirements that go in with that. Or they can look at a solar panel installations. So they could pick one of those 2. And then in addition, if the parking lot is that large, they have to put in street trees, street-like facing facilities along driveways, so pedestrian benches and other amenities. And then the last one is to set a parking maximums in appropriate locations, downtowns, community centers, transit-oriented developments. And as I just mentioned, we already have maximums at 150%. So I think we're okay on that one. Then in March, at the end of March, a city is required to require new multifamily residential or mixed use. So it's a combination of residential and commercial when you have more than 5 or more units to install conduit to serve 40% of all the parking spaces on site. So if a developer puts in 10 parking spaces, then 40% of those would have to be ready. The conduit would have to be provided so that they could put in EV charging stations. And then the last one that goes into effect as part of parking B is to set parking maximums in climate-friendly areas. I'm not sure where the city's at on our process for designating the climate-friendly areas, but in those particular areas, it will be a little bit different maximums than the 150% that I talked about. It's more use specific, like studios and apartments. And then if you're located near transit, those parking maximums will be a little bit different. And we'll work on those once we have our climate friendly areas designated. So with phase 2, you have to do everything we just went over. Plus the city has to pick one of 3 options that also goes into effect by the end of June of this year or next year, 2023. So option 1 is just to repeal all parking mandates, which means get rid of all the minimums. And then the developer can still put in parking up to the maximums that are allowed. Option 2 is consider the fair parking policies. So there's 5 policies up on the screen, and the city actually would have to codify 3 of those or more to implement this option 2. So the 5 policies include unbundling parking for residential units with 5 or more units, unbundling leased commercial parking, adding a requirement for flexible commute benefits for businesses with more than 50 employees. One option would be to tax commercial parking lots. And the last one would be to reduce the multifamily parking requirement. So we just went from 1 starting at the end of this year. This would be down to a half a space for multifamily development. So the city, again, with option 2, has to pick at least 3 of these 5 policies. If the city can also consider option 3, which is 15 reductions. So option 1, repeal all parking. Option 2, you have to pick policies. Option 3 is implementing 15 of these parking reductions. So you would eliminate parking minimums for a variety of uses, small sites, which I believe is under 2 acres, vacant buildings, studio apartments or 1-bedroom apartments, and a number of other uses. Bullets 2 and 3, basically, if you do a change of use for your building or you do an expansion of less than 30% of the building footprint, then the city wouldn't be allowed to require any additional parking for those uses. And then no parking mandates will be allowed within a half a mile of a climate friendly area. And then to designate districts to manage on-street residential parking, which we have one already in Bend. We just have to do more to implement these 15 reductions. So if a city goes with option 2 or 3, option 1 is obviously the simplest. You just repeal parking, you're done. If a city chooses to go with options 2 and 3, they have these additional requirements up on the screen. So one is 8 additional regulations that a city would be required to do. So you eliminate or reduce parking minimums based on if there's solar panels on site, if they provide a number of electrical vehicle charging stations, if they implement car sharing, if they develop more accessible units than's required, or if there's off-site parking. It would require unbundling parking for multifamily units near frequent transit. And then making a statement that garage parking must count towards your minimum parking requirements. And that a city, which we don't already today, but cities are not allowed to count garages or are not allowed to require dwelling units to have garages or carports, which we don't today. And then provisions for shared parking must be allowed to meet parking mandates. So again, options 2 and 3, you have to adopt those 8 additional regulations in addition to pricing on street parking. And there's 2 phases for pricing on street parking. For the first phase, it has to go into effect by September 30th, 2023. So September of next year, 5% of the total on-street parking spaces in the city of Bend have to be priced. And then by September of 2025, that increases to 10% of the total on-street parking supply has to be priced. So what this looks like is that for the permits we already have today, we'd have to raise the price of the permits to be in compliance for almost 1,200 existing district spaces. And then we have to add an additional 1,300 parking spaces that would be priced by the end of September. So by the end of September, it would be over 3,000 spaces that have to be priced. And then by September of 2025, that doubles. So you'd be looking at a little over 6,000 parking spaces in the city would have to be priced. So just a little summary here is phase 1 goes into effect by the end of this year and has the minimal parking reductions. And then phase 2 has some requirements for the city with parking B, and then the city has to adopt either option 1, 2, or 3 by the end of June. So the city council held a work session and just reviewed exactly what I went over with parking A and B and the options, and directed staff to draft amendments to implement option 1, which is to repeal all parking requirements. They also had a good discussion on accessible parking, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about that here in a moment. So the proposed amendments that are out right now, Planning Commission's already held a public hearing and recommended approval of the city council for these amendments. The amendments include adding new definitions, like we need to define electric service capacity if we're going to require 40% of parking spots to include this for multifamily. So we add new definition. We deleted any reference to garage parking space sizes. We have a chapter that includes all our master plans like Discovery West, Northwest Crossings, Petrosa. If there's any references to minimum parking requirements in those master plans, that has been deleted. And then the big chapter 3.3, which addresses our vehicle parking requirements, that's been amended to eliminate parking minimums, clarify those maximums at 150%, add the electric service capacity requirements, which again goes into effect at the end of March. And then just as a cleanup, we've revised the parking stall dimensions and bicycle parking requirements. Another chapter is 3.6, which we had to go through and propose eliminating parking requirements for affordable housing, home businesses, neighborhood commercial sites, temporary uses, short-term rentals, and shelters. And 3.8, this has our development alternatives. So it deletes all parking requirements for micro units, small dwelling units, cottage developments, urban dwelling sites, and shared courts. So basically, it's just a cleanup going through any reference to minimum parking requirements is being proposed to be deleted. And then,
So that's now citywide,
well, this is being proposed citywide, yes.
proposed citywide, no parking minimums, basically.
Correct. A developer can still put in parking. We're just not going to tell you how many parking spaces to be put in. And then 2 more edits in chapter 4.2. We look at businesses when they do a change of use to see if they're increasing their parking demand. Since we're not worried about minimum parkings, we just had to amend that section. And then we have a transportation and parking demand management plan requirement, and you get credits for reducing parking. And since we're not going to have any parking, we don't need those credits. And then lastly, the code today, we always have minimum parking requirements in most cases, I should say. And anytime you put in 1 parking spaces for like commercial or industrial uses or multifamily, that triggers accessible parking requirements. And it goes in increments of 25. So for the first parking space that's put on site, one of those needs to be an accessible parking space. So the question was asked, if you don't require any parking minimums and a developer chooses not to put in any parking, how do we still address accessible parking requirements? And so the proposal is in number 2 here. If the developer chooses not to put in parking, we're still going to require 1 van accessible parking space on site for those multifamily type developments, commercial or industrial uses. We did include some exemptions, recognizing that some of these areas today do not have parking minimums, and then and that they wouldn't have put in accessible parking. So basically in the downtown core, there's no parking minimums today because they could pay an in lieu fee. So they would not be required to put in accessible parking. And then developments in the Bend Central District, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but there's so many exemptions in that area that you can basically not put in any parking if you meet any of the exemptions. And if you did, we wouldn't require accessible parking today. So we don't want to be any more restrictive than we are today. So there'd be no parking minimums for downtown for the Bend Central District. And then recognizing the difficulty sometimes on developing small lots, particularly like in the Bend Central District, on lots that are 10,000 square feet or smaller than 10,000 square feet, you would not be required to put in accessible parking. Now, if any of these areas put in any parking, that will trigger an accessible parking space to be put on site. So this is a type 4 process, and the Planning Commission held their hearing on November 28th, recommended support of the proposed amendments to the City Council. The City Council, we have a goal of getting this through the City Council by the end of this year because of parking A also going into effect by the end of this year. And we didn't want any confusion for the development community or neighborhoods to we'd have these different parking requirements for such a short amount of time. So going with option A or option 1, eliminating all parking minimums, implements basically parking A at the same time. So the goal is to have the City Council hearing on December 7th, with the second reading on December 21st, and then adopted by emergency on January 1st. However, there's some legal actions taking place right now and requesting a stay on the CFAC rules so that they would not go into effect. And because of that, staff is recommending that we continue the public hearing for the parking amendments to January 18th. So still propose no parking minimums as the package of Bend Development Code amendments, but not base it on the CFAC requirements, but base it on more of our comprehensive plan policies. So it would be continued to January 18th for the first reading. Second reading would be February 1st, and I believe it might still be adopted by emergency, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So I know it's a lot of information, but I can answer any questions you may have about the amendments or the timing of the code amendments too.
Thank you, Pauline. Have you heard any input from the development community negatively for the elimination of parking minimums? So generally speaking, I'm a fan of less regulation. I think giving the freedom to developers is generally good when you have developers who are thoughtful. My concern is you get some that try to put a misplaced development in Bend and have, you know, underserved parking, and then come to find out it puts a burden on, you know, the surrounding businesses, and people are parking on the street 6 blocks away from their apartment, so on and so forth. But my concern could be completely unfounded, which is why I asked what feedback you received.
I mean, I haven't personally received any too much input from the development community. Surprisingly, even with public comments, it's probably 50-50, and I don't even have a lot of those yet for the proposed amendments. And a lot of people are in support of these amendments, recognizing that, you know, the option's still there to put in parking, and then there's always, you know, public on-street parking. And then there's opposition to the proposed amendments as well.
Gotcha. Kevin?
My question is, assuming there's, or if there is a stay, has the city staff been instructed to have a ripcord to not move forward with these if the requirement is deemed unconstitutional?
My understanding is that's, you know, we're going to amend the findings so that this City Council hearing is this Wednesday, and it's unlikely we will hear about the stay by then. And that's why we're continuing it to January 18th, because my understanding is we'll hear about it by the end of this month. Regardless of the stay, we are going to revise the findings, is my understanding, to not propose amendments based on CFAC, but to move forward with the proposed amendments based on our comprehensive plan policies that speak of monitoring and reducing parking requirements.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too, Pauline.
Thanks, Russ.
Yeah, if the stay does happen, then we will be having a conversation with council, because they'd already expressed interest in removing parking minimums back at the beginning of the year. We asked them kindly to kind of pause and let us figure out what's going on with these new rules, because it may be answering the questions that they're trying to address. If we do get a stay, that's the question we'd be asking council is, do you want to continue with this process of removing parking minimums anyway? And that's what Pauline's referring to. If they say yes to that, then we need to go back and change the findings and supporting documents around why we're doing this, because it wouldn't be based off of what's out of the climate and friendly rulemaking process. It's more of council policy direction backed up by some policies in our comp plan.
Thank you. And are you guys planning anything to assist property owners who have adjacent properties and currently have to manage or will have to manage the the parking on their property when their neighbors build no parking?
We don't, and Pauline, I'll take this one because it kind of goes into parking enforcement. So
Okay.
There's nothing specific in these rules, but what we are going to see if you continue down this path is parking management and parking enforcement and parking areas and zones. Those will continue to evolve over time. And we know that to make kind of more dense areas work effectively, the way we manage our parking is going to be in this continuum of change from now until cars start flying and we'll have to worry about how we're going to support them with aerial parking lots. But so it'll just keep evolving over time. The good thing is we'll be able to, it's not like we're going to go from, our current condition to complete, dense parking overnight. We'll be able to see that and work through those things, but we're expecting parking programs to become much more part of the city's operations.
Yeah, I can chime in too, because I've been chatting with Toby Marks, our parking manager, and he certainly has a lot of ideas kind of that he's working on around the central district and other areas that may see more dense development. And really we're going to see enforcement of parking requirements and how we manage parking moving from the point of permit to later on, right? As a business or a building becomes occupied in a different manner than it was before. That's a big change for our permitting folks.
Right.
So Toby's showing up I think, next week to talk to all the managers in that group, but could be an interesting conversation for BDAB as we get into 2023.
And
as well.
you do want to watch how these things evolve, because we could have our best idea of what's going to happen and what the parking management plan needs to be. But really you need to, you start to see some trends and some indicators of when enforcement needs to happen. I don't know if you remember OSU. As soon as OSU went in, everybody wanted us to immediately create a parking program out there. And we're like, it's not, yes, there are people parking on the street, but it's still manageable in the existing state. We don't need to do parking enforcement and paid parking and things like that at this point.
Right. And are there any carve outs for, like, for example, food truck lots that generate a lot of short-term vehicle traffic, restaurants, other things like that, or is just exempt across the board from parking requirements?
So Russ, I'll jump on this one. So the way the state wrote the CFAC rules, and let's say we're just moving forward based on CFAC, if you go with option one, you have to remove all parking minimums, because I even asked about short-term rentals, and you have to remove all parking minimums. You cannot do any carve-outs. Once you start doing carve-outs, then you have to move forward with these, either option 2 or 3.
So the vision is to make everything like the district around the hospital. That's what we're trying to achieve here.
We're actually trying to, the true goals are trying to achieve more density, providing services and more complete communities and closer proximities to each other to reduce. Basically, the state's coming out and saying you need to reduce vehicle miles traveled as part of the climate initiatives. In order to do that, you need to start putting in these kind of friction points around parking and how we're developing our infrastructure to support that. That's really what's driving that's the backbone of this conversation.
Yeah, it's always made sense to me to, make it easier for developers to build in dense, bring density in. The whole idea of the BCD is to densify things, and, the people who live down there are going to either they walk 6 blocks to their house, or they don't have a car and they choose to walk everywhere, bike, and use transportation. It's like
Right, and places where this is effective have transit systems, unlike Central Oregon.
Yeah, and you're going to part of the heart of the conversation about the implementation of these rules that a lot of cities are struggling with, saying this all makes sense. I don't think there's any of us that are saying we don't agree with it, but I know that some of the cities are saying they're either bedroom communities or you're creating a system dependent on transit, but we don't even have a transit system, or it's not well funded.
Right, but I mean, transit system takes a while to build, and so does all the density. Right, so I mean, if we know this is coming, hopefully the council will also work on, transit system at the same time, or whoever is in charge of that.
Cascade East Transit.
Yeah.
Can't-
Yeah. I think
Hashtag not the city, right? Megan?
I did link to an article from the Corvallis Gazette Times about Corvallis adopting this, and their city council's feedback was the other options are so onerous that
Yep.
Corvallis, a place I went to school, right? A smaller town, less robust transit system, less density than Bend. They're like, the other alternatives are so painful to kind of adopt and work through and implement that they really begrudgingly said, yeah, we'll go with the option to remove parking minimums.
We didn't go
as well.
begrudgingly, but we looked at it. And
Yeah.
we are not in a position to have, we just don't have the staff or the capacity. Or if we did, it would remove staff from maybe higher policy initiatives that council wants us to do. So that, just looking at it, we are the easiest, and we already kind of had some leading discussion with council about removing parking minimum. So that's why we kind of landed on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people don't think about the amount of time it takes to implement for things to get crowded. And also people often can't, I think even one of the people on the planning committee, I think it was the planning commission, I was in on one of the meetings. And she was saying, she goes, well, if there's no parking minimums or something, when I, what am I gonna do with all my Costco groceries? If I was living downtown in the BCD and I have all these groceries and this and that, it's like, well, it doesn't make it. She didn't even figure out that people live in the BCD are living in small apartments, 1 or 2 people in these places, and they're not shopping at Costco. They don't have room to store stuff at Costco. So you don't need a car to bring your groceries from Costco if you're living in these areas, because physically have nowhere to put all the Costco items. So some people, I think a lot of people, one of the problems is people can't imagine, because I shop at Costco. I got lots of room to store all this stuff, right? But I also, my kids were just living in Portland. My son still lives in Portland and has no car. He's lived there for years with no car. He survives. He gets everywhere he wants. He takes scooters, bikes, walks, gets rides with people. I mean, I'm all sorts of stuff. He gets off work at 2 a.m. sometimes, rides scooters home, ride a little lemon lime scooter or whatever those things are home at 2 a.m. I don't know. You make do. I guess when you're 25, it's easy to do. And I think the assumption is that in the BCD, the people living down there are going to be in their 20s and early 30s, most likely.
So I think this discussion's been helpful. If I were to kind of break down how I think of it, you got two parts. The first one is, if we have to implement CFEC rules, I think the city's probably going about it the right way, and I don't see any opportunity for BDAP to provide much feedback. But the second piece, which is if CFEC is not the reason, and we're coming up with another reason to remove parking minimums, I think we need to take a pause and get more community feedback. Is there any agreement on BDAB for that kind of discussion point, that maybe we provide feedback around that?
Yes, supportive.
I just feel like it's a rushed thing to align with CFEC, and we shouldn't use this opportunity to continue to rush if CFEC is no longer the reason.
And Pauline, that would come back to council at their second meeting if we have the stay, right?
Yeah, I
Second
think-
meeting in January, so BDAP would have time.
I think as soon as we know what's going on with the stay and the ruling on the stay, then we would figure out, that'll kind of determine the next touch point with council and what we're gonna kind of trying to get direction.
And it is continued, Ben, to the January 18th. If council chooses to do so, it would be open and continued to January 18th.
We can make sure we have an update then for BDAB. Or before then, your next meeting should be January 9th, if I'm looking at the calendar correctly. Unless any of you want to come in on the New Year's Day holiday.
Probably not.
So we can revisit that then and just see where things stand, and BDAP can develop some feedback when you have a quorum, if that works.
I think that works unless it becomes apparent we need to provide feedback sooner. It looks like my internet's unstable.
Looks like you're moving now, at least.
That is good. All right, that looks a little bit better. All right, anybody else have any more feedback for parking minimums before we jump on to home energy score?
I'm not seeing anyone.
All right.
No,
I was worried it was frozen. Okay. All right. So let's transition into the home energy score, kind of start our discussion. We left off last month. We had an impassioned couple of folks advocating for the home energy score as presented, and I think we felt some internal resistance, but we didn't get a chance to chat about it. So Keith or Kevin, either of you want to kick us off on kind of your thought? Because the second got cut off.
You're cutting out a bit, Travis. This is not the time. We want to be losing you.
We're losing him. He's frozen. Yeah.
I'm happy to talk. I don't see any need to create this as a mandate. If it's truly a market-driven solution like they described it as, then homeowners can purchase a service if they want it. Otherwise, I think it's one more thing to interfere in the process of selling a home and disproportionately affects older and poorer homeowners who live in older homes.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, I think it'll disproportionately hurt lower income and lower socioeconomic people. The old houses or the cheap houses in Bend, those are the people who are going to be either getting less money upon a sale or be incentivized highly to do expensive repairs on their homes. And yeah, I don't know, with interest rates where they're at and everything like that, it's definitely not it doesn't make any sense at all to me to add that. And, I don't know, we didn't get too many questions answered at the last meeting. Every time we tried to say something, we seem to get interrupted and talked over. So I don't know. Maybe I got a little bit of my saying. I don't know. Seemed like it. There was a little bit of argument. Not used to people coming in presenting and kind of arguing with us. I don't know. It's interesting, but then I guess as Travis later found out, and then from checking from my cousin, the one guy has a bit of a conflict, whether perceived or what, because I guess his business is going to benefit highly from potentially this repair stuff. From what my cousin actually knows him and had looked, because he has a lot of older rental houses, and apparently he's talked to the guy about what he does, and he goes in and he has these machinery that, I don't know if you know, it seals it's like an air fan type thing that blows stuff in every crack, I guess, or whatever.
Yeah, and hopefully Travis jumps back on. Travis did chat with Peter group after the last meeting, and Travis and I had a chance to have lunch last week, so I can kind of cobble the conversation or keep the conversation going until he jumps back on. But he's getting here. So Travis talked to Peter for that kind of home ceiling energy score, energy survey, whatever you want to call it. That's more intrusive than what this home energy score would be, and Travis can probably jump in now. So the feedback was, Peter probably doesn't have a conflict in this case after they kind of talked. And of course, as we talked about on email, it's more a conflict like you're voting on an advisory board to say, hey, I have a potential conflict or a real conflict.
Potential, but I mean,
But there are very, very strong feelings about this. I think
Right.
I've seen it in other committee meetings as well.
so the stuff that he does wouldn't improve a house's score, what his company does?
I mean, it could improve a score, but it wouldn't necessarily be administering the home energy scores.
No, I understand
Yeah.
that, but
It'd be kind of the
somebody
next level.
advocating here in front of us who is gonna make potentially a lot of money if this passes.
So I can speak to that now that I've got better signal, Keith. So that was exactly my concern, and Peter and I had coffee to discuss that concern. His company will only work on new homes. It's not a remodel, improve your energy score before you sell your home type of service. So yes, it addresses home efficiency, but no, it is not going to be a recipient of a lot of business because of this home energy score implementation.
Yeah, we're still trying to keep you on your toes with very not argumentative, but advocates coming into the meeting. A little different than it used to be a few years ago, right? I think people have stronger feelings on different boards about different policies, so probably something we'll see more of in the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Couldn't even complete my question, I think. Anyways, but I think I'm in agreement with Kevin, that, yeah, I mean, it's, I've had some old homes and I know they're drafty and whatever, and I had them when, I didn't have nearly as much money, and that's why, and then we're really thinking about how housing works and families and how they start in something cheaper and hopefully move up to a different house and a different house. Well, how much is the real estate market being affected right now by interest rates and people not being able to sell their houses and not wanting to sell their houses because just the old interest rate versus the new interest rate is causing them issues. And this is just, one more thing where they get a low score and they either take potentially $20,000 less, or they spend that money and fix up their houses. I think they were trying to tell me that, I don't know, one guy he started going around in circles almost talking about how they wanted to incentivize it. The reason for this is to incentivize people to fix up the old housing stock. Then he started saying that it won't affect the prices of the old housing stock. And I was like, well, how can that not be? If, you're either devaluing something, and then, I don't know, it wasn't making much sense, which in a way, the more I thought about it, and, maybe it has no effect other than charging people $200 more, because instead of thinking about when he showed the thing, the confusing box, the colorful box that I guess you're going to put on the front door of the house or whatever, right? It's like those energy tags that you see on every appliance now that has, kilowatt usage per year and all that kind of stuff. Does anybody look at those things? And then he showed us, right, a sample that looked almost like one of those appliance stickers and said, oh, it'll be like this, and I'm looking at it like, I have no idea what that thing means. Just like when I look at one of those appliance stickers, do any of us pay attention to those stickers when we buy an appliance? No, we buy stainless steel or black or whatever fits our kitchen and whatever brand we like and whatever gets the highest ratings. We don't pay attention to that energy stuff anyway. So maybe it's a moot point. Maybe it's just the $200 and that's the only effect. I don't know.
I think Travis may have frozen again. He did tell me about 1 to 1:15 was when he was going to be in a tough spot. That's fine. We'll be through everything by then. So
very good timing.
Brianna, do you have any thoughts? I'll try to keep us moving here. And just for the three of you, and Travis knows this because we spoke just before, we don't have a quorum today. And if BDAB wants to weigh in before the 7th, would have to schedule a very brief kind of special meeting to approve any sort of feedback. I told Travis like 15 minutes from noon to 12:15 tomorrow, right? Or would find a time that worked if the group really does want to weigh in. And I think your feedback does align with maybe where some of the other committees are landing. I think, Brianna, before you weigh in, Travis did also tell me his feedback or proposal for the group was going to be, if council does want to move forward with the home energy score, following that line of feedback from COBA and exempting the newest 7 years of housing stock that have been built under the last 2 rounds of the building efficiency code as kind of a compromise or one area to maybe improve. But Brianna, if you have any thoughts, turn it over to you.
Yeah, I guess in some ways I'm what I like about it is that I think that it can give a pathway. What I understood was that there can be items that are identified that you can then invest in to improve the energy efficiency of your home. So on an older home, maybe you don't have a lot of resources to do all of them, or you're not going to totally renovate the house, but you can then pick and choose based on those items. And thinking about first time home buyers and things like that, that may be interested in that. There's going to be a sustainability initiative that's going to align there. Do I think that it needs to be mandated? I could be persuaded either way. I think to Travis's point earlier, like less government restriction and input is sometimes better. I think having the tool and being able to apply that to the real estate industry could be a benefit for homeowners as well as those looking to buy homes, and that there could be those that are interested in doing it on their own.
Yeah, and if you think it's gonna stay at $200 very long, you're delusional. Every single time you mandate something in a real estate transaction and your lender can't order it and your realtor can't order it, so then we have a third party. This thing will be $1,500 in 5 years like appraisals are now. And it without fail, every mandate in the mortgage space has done nothing but raise cost.
Yeah. And I think there's, to that point, there's probably plenty of that. There's plenty of paperwork associated with buying and selling homes already. I don't know if we need to add more, but I do think that there is, I think as far as conceptually the idea behind it and what it is trying to do, I'm in favor of that. Is this the right way to go about it? I think there's a lot of things that we've discussed that are relevant.
Well, it's all fine, but to think it's not going to add cost to housing is kind of ludicrous. If I've lived in some of these old neighborhoods, and if three of us are selling on the same street and all of our houses are built in 1978, and I do $15,000 worth of stuff, I'm going to price my house higher. I'm going to get a higher score and I'm going to get that money back out. So I'm going to sell mine higher. And will this score bring buyers to me rather than the other two cheaper? I don't know, but I'm going to try to get my money back out of it, and I'm going to go for a higher price.
Right. And
who wouldn't?
Yeah, I don't think that that's the, maybe that was what was said at that meeting, but I think you're right on with that as far as what would actually happen. And I think that's actually a benefit to those that are owning the homes, right? If you can invest in something and it provides value to it and more people are interested in it and it benefits the environment or our local community, why? Yeah, all of those seem like good things. It maybe is not aligning with affordability, but
Oh, maybe it'll help keep the contractors busy when our construction market crashes next summer. So there's an upside there.
Travis, can you hear us?
I can, but hesitant to chime in because who knows how long I can hear you. But I think what I'm hearing is from the group that's here, and we obviously need to get more BDAP members to weigh in, but there may be an appetite to provide feedback to council. And that feedback may be negatively disposed to the mandate. And then maybe a second piece, if it's mandated, we have a window of recent homes that don't have to comply with it simply because they're already very energy efficient based on energy code. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I would think so.
And I can't speak for Brenda Spears in detail, but we did trade a couple of emails, and I would say Brianna, her feedback was in line with yours in a lot of ways. Understand the intent, but not a fan of the mandatory nature of it. So
Ben, we can't hear you.
what the
Thank
heck?
you,
Can you
Gina.
hear me now? How close am I talking to this thing? Yeah, so I can't speak in detail for Brenda Spears, but she would make a quorum, and Brianna, I think her feedback was very much in line with yours at the high level we spoke about this. So just if you're counting votes, because you need 5.
But the concerning thing about potential increases in cost, Kevin, I hear you. Like I just transacted a home. All those fees were outrageously more than they were the last time I sold a home. So I can attest things do get more expensive with time. One positive thing on this home energy score piece is Austin's had it for several years, and you can get them for $150 a house now in Austin. Obviously a lot more competition. Obviously in Texas, professional services are a little less expensive, but that bodes well for long-term and being, call it $300 a house or under for us, in my mind.
I think also if newer, the newer stock was exempted, whatever the, 7-year stock was exempted, then there would be, fewer needed and, less demand and hopefully less run up in cost.
So Ben, talk to us about logistics of scheduling a follow-up call and noticed meeting so that we could take a vote potentially.
Making sure to speak directly into the mic here. So Gina, would you be able to send an email out right after this meeting to the BDAB members? We're talking this close. The BDAB members, just trying to schedule a 15-minute call. We could host it in council chambers as well, because I think we have to, but it would just be me in here and everyone else could be on Zoom. Probably tomorrow. And I could write up a letter by tomorrow morning that kind of tries to reflect the key points here and let the group react to it over 10 or 15 minutes, and you can have a motion. We just want to make sure there's at least 5 people in the room.
Yes,
Or-
I can get that set up.
Is there a time that doesn't work for anybody tomorrow? We're gonna need a lot of bodies.
I really have no options other than at 8 a.m. and after 3.
Ideally after 3, so I could write up a letter this afternoon and circulate it with this group. Or
After 3 is good for me, actually. I have a 2:00 and lunch appointment.
I have a 3 o'clock. I could do 3:30 or 4.
I think at the end of the day, we should just meet for a beer.
Is that an option?
Apparently no. Would 3:30 work for everyone here?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Gina, would you mind checking with the other 3 folks? Right after this call, the other 3, I think it's 3. We've
There are only
7
7
on.
of us right now?
Yeah, and that's what's making the quorum a little tough to get, right?
Right.
So,
Yes, I will do that, Ben.
perfect. All right, so
Alright.
we'll write something up, we'll get it circulated, and we'll get rolling.
That sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for that. Now on the downhill slide for the agenda, economic development strategy update. When's our December meeting, Ben?
Yeah, so we pushed everything out, and I have to be honest, some of the CFEC discussions are impacting kind of the timelines as well, because if we do have a stay, and there's actually 2 lawsuits challenging the climate-friendly and equitable cities right now. There's a cities one, and there's one that dropped on Friday that I would broadly say represents a fair number of industries statewide. That isn't going to stop our work around urban growth boundaries and land use, but it may result in a pivot on what growth management's doing. So we've been having some internal discussions. Really, my ask for this group is, are you okay with us moving we're calling it a kickoff. It's not doesn't mean no work has happened before it, but a kickoff in January. I've spoken with Damon Runberg about it. He'd be eager to give a presentation on kind of where the economy stands. We'll have our 2 new counselors seated by then. We'll also have 2 hopefully new BDAB members seated by then. So a good kind of way to get everyone on the same page. At that same time, Don, who I now will always think of as Bernie Galore based on his Zoom title. Don is in my office every Wednesday in the morning, so we have a chance to kind of chat, and we've started talking about what these SWOT, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis will look like in terms of surveying stakeholders. So we want to work on that through the rest of December. Really probably get the whole group together back in early January. Excuse me, the working group together in early January to look at both that work and a little bit of a plan around what we're calling sector targeting. So we want to actually go and maybe get a consultant, relatively nominal amount of money to get a consultant in that does this work around figuring out where your strengths are in terms of attracting certain industries, and really outsource that component of the work is kind of our goal. I'm trying not to be too trite. I got quoted as quipping in a meeting recently by Richard Coe in an editorial. And Richard, you're probably watching this right now. I've said to Don that it feels like if we're sitting around a table going, what's our target sector? We're essentially navel gazing, right? We're sitting here and saying, well, we do bioscience really well, so we're going to do bioscience really well in the future. So can we get an outside set of eyes to look at kind of the sectors that we may be able to attract based on what we do well here that we may not be thinking of right now. So that's kind of what the push is, to outsource or get a consultant on board to look at that sector targeting. Like I said, it's not this huge effort. I think it's maybe a month or 2 months that we could do under a relatively small, what we call a direct appoint type contract. So really kind of keeping moving on all those things, and then really reconvening in January is kind of my goal here, if that works for everyone. And if there are stays issued that give us some more certainty around where things stand with CFEC, we may actually have a different avenue to go around to pursue for council goal setting as well, around pursuing economic opportunity analysis and housing needs analyses more quickly than perhaps even we were thinking on BDAB, just in your strategic planning work. So that's my update. It's very muddled, I realize that, but hopefully it kind of it's me saying, can we pick this up in January?
As long as we don't push the completion date.
Yeah, and I don't think we will. I think that's the important thing here. Either way, we're going to end up with some feedback for council around March, when goal setting is kind of in full swing. And then really the target is to have a pretty polished product by the time Travis, Keith, and Kevin, you all exit your 6 years on BDAB. 6 years, almost 2 World Cups.
Basically,
That sounds like a plan.
See you next month.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah. I may reach out to some of you with questions, especially as Don and I chat over the next couple
Well,
of
I guess
weeks.
we're gonna solve each other tomorrow.
That's true. Although that'll be for one agenda item. 2, we have to approve the minutes from this meeting or last meeting. So that's it. That works.
Did you have dates circled yet or not yet, Ben?
I do not. I'll work with Damon. That kickoff. Want to give everyone a chance to kind of get back from the holidays. So probably at least the second week of January. We'll get those firmed up with a couple of dates and a doodle poll pretty quick here.
Sounds good to me.
Cool.
How about any upcoming topics from the group that we want to think about putting on our agenda and chasing maybe in the first quarter of next year?
Yeah, and I think we've got some stuff percolating that I can't really go into too much detail yet, but I think so I'll be out of the office for the last 5-10 days of December as well. And of course, we don't have a meeting on January 2nd. So I wanted to get an agenda out early. We'll certainly talk about the economic development strategy. I think we'll have an update on the climate friendly and equitable communities rules at that point, because I'm sure a lot's going to have changed in the next month. But curious if there's any other items. We should have some new BDAB members at that point, but if there are items or updates any of you would like, wanted to kind of get those out now so I can maybe line up some folks to present if there's an interest.
I wanted to mention one thing to BDAB, and Ben's well aware of this. We talk about it all the time, and that is the strategy for economic development out on the airport is unclear because we've had staffing challenges and it's a complicated kind of area and so on. And I know Ben's worked hard on trying to get that moving forward. And I think we have, with Matt Stewart on board, there's a great chance. And I would just like to keep that front and center with BDAB, because I continually, I have 2 really large aviation manufacturing companies looking at Bend. And Bend, kind of like the bioscience, is really an attractive place for aviation because we have this great long history of aviation in the region and all these resources that are here. So we're attracting really great projects. And I would just like to make those feasible or so I can make them feasible, put a pitch into a proposal that makes us a viable choice. And so I know Ben's working on that, but I don't think I've expressed that to BDAB, and just would like to make sure that when we come talk about those things, it's not a new subject.
That's a really good one, and probably for a little later in the early spring, Don. But yeah, Matt Stewart is kind of transitioning back up to the city of Bend right now. He's our new real estate director, but he won't be living here full time until March. So probably a March timeline for him to come and talk to BDAB. But he's up here this week, and he poked his head into my office this morning, and we spent a good 20 minutes talking about the airport and just the airport. So yeah, I like that idea.
Then how about having Heather fixed on the calendar maybe for January?
That's great. Thanks, Travis. And Heather, when we talked to her last week, really brought up sector targeting as something they're working on too, right? So yes, I'll get Heather plugged in.
Yeah, I mean, workforce development, just as an update generally, that they've been very successful in they're growing their services, they're collaborating with DOCs. And then one thing on my mind too is Oregon State University's Cascades campus and their innovation district. We heard an update a few months ago, but with Kelly no longer there, you know, maybe it's not until February or March or April, but could we get OSU Cascades to kind of tell us where the thrust of their efforts are going there now? And is there somebody driving that effort? How can the city help?
That's great. Yep, we can line that up. Not seeing any more ideas.
Hey, Ben, it's not really related to a future topic as much as a current topic, but does the city have any responsibility for Measure 114 implementation, or is that all going to Deschutes County here?
The police department does, and the police department rolled out a press release on it this morning, which I didn't read, but I did see the headline. So I will share that with BDAB, and yeah, that's probably the best jumping off point for this.
And there's, you know, some retail activity and jobs related to that might be at risk.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll send out that press release right after, Kevin, and yeah, if you want to kind of make that connection, I think we can get Chief Cranston here to kind of talk at a future meeting as well.
I think it'll be resolved by the time it gets on our agenda. It's more immediate concern.
Okay.
I think all it's done right now is created more opportunity to sell firearms.
Right.
I don't know. I don't think business is being hurt that way.
All right.
Until Thursday.
Press release. I know different jurisdictions have had different responses to that, as I've seen from Twitter.
That issue's keeping the lawyers busy.
Yes. Well, cool. I mean, if any of you have other ideas, certainly let me know. You all know where to find me.
Then talk about recruitment. You've had a list of applicants. You feel like it's a robust list. Is there any gaps that we can help fill by making phone calls?
Yeah, I mean, so we're kind of moving into a different way we handle recruitments on BDAB. We're doing biannual recruitments for all committees at once. So late fall, and then I'd call it late spring heading into June. So I don't have the same kind of leeway to push the application timeline based on me thinking we have enough applicants or not. But we did have 11, which I think was about as many as any committee got. And it was a pretty robust kind of coverage of retail folks, development folks, some other industries that are underrepresented. I will say there were some people that reached out after the deadline that expressed an interest, and I was able to say to them, hey, we're going to have 3 openings in June. So if you are talking to folks that may have an interest that missed this time period, I mean, there's a a pretty good opportunity to apply coming up very soon, but I think we have a pretty robust list for the 2 openings that council's seeking to fill here.
Great, glad to hear it. Well, good deal. Well, if there's nothing else for the good of the order, we've got maybe a half an hour of our days to give back. Does anybody have anything else?
No, you're better than daylight savings time, man. Giving us a half hour.
On that note, everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Bye.